Welcome to the Tyler's Place podcast, the official podcast of the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry, Southern Jurisdiction, Mother Supreme Council of the World. I am your host, Matt Bowers, 32nd degree Scottish Rite Mason, and this episode of the Tyler's Place was a long time in the making, and I'm so happy that it finally happened, because you're going to hear a conversation between Brother Maynard Edwards, 33rd degree Scottish Rite Mason, and Brother Sean Butler. Brother Sean Butler is the Director of Membership and Communications for the United Grand Lodge of England, and he is also one of the hosts of the Craftcast, the Freemasons podcast, which is the official podcast of the United Grand Lodge of England. So I won't go on any further. I'm going to allow you to sit back, relax, and enjoy this great conversation between Brother Maynard Edwards and Brother Sean Butler.
First of all, enjoy the show. Love to be able to hear Masonry from a different perspective. But you guys were a little late to the podcast party in terms of creating an official podcast for the UGLE. And it's a little bit of a crowded space. We've been doing it here for quite some time, but what made the United Grand Lodge of England finally decide to dip their toe into that pond, if you will?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I mean, I think from our perspective, it was a case of we'd been sort of looking at it for a while, and we knew that it was a method of communication that, as you say, we hadn't sort of dipped our toe in, and we were familiar with a number of Masonic podcasts from across the pond that you guys were doing, and all very interesting, and it was really for us a matter of time. We always knew it was going to be something we were going to do, but it was just a case of us positioning ourselves. One thing I'm really wary of, particularly in sort of communications and marketing as a space, there's a great temptation to jump headfirst into things that on first appearance seem, a sort of step forward or a development. The best example I can think of recently would be Threads, right, which was sort of brought out by Meta as its sort of answer to X, and we sort of dived headfirst into that, and then realized, I think, quite quickly that it wasn't going to ever really compete. Creating a podcast, investing in it as a piece of communications is a big commitment, and I think we just wanted to make sure that we had our ducks in a row, as we would say, to make sure that we had everything ready and was as sort of prepared as it can be. And then also, everyone and anyone has a podcast nowadays, right? And actually, I think if you haven't got something of interest to say, then you shouldn't do it. And I think for us, we just wanted to make sure that when we took that great leap into the unknown, we wanted to make sure that actually we had something that was engaging, and that actually, was good enough to properly represent UGLE on an international, on a sort of world stage.
Yeah, and that's an important thing to mention. I mean, you guys do bear that responsibility of being sort of the mothership, if you will. So, if you're just Joe Mason and you throw up a podcast, it doesn't affect much of anything. But when you become attached, and we're very sensitive to this as well, because, we're the official podcast of the Scottish Rite in Southern Jurisdiction in the USA. So, there is that responsibility to, in your opinion as Sean may be a little different from the United Grand Lodge of England's opinion. So it's difficult to have that free form conversation and not because you have to be afraid of stepping on your own toes, so to speak.
Exactly right. And it's something we're always sort of conscious of. And to be fair, I think we've been really careful not to, as is quite right from our perspective, not to touch on anything that might be considered sort of controversial or and I think that's a wise move with any sort of Masonic piece of comms, because we don't want anything that's going to encourage or promote disharmony of any kind, because it's un-Masonic to do so. So, it's right that actually we sort of talk about the things that are important to UGLE, and we talk about the things that are important to to the world of Freemasonry, really. And and I hear that even in listening to your podcast and listening to other podcasts that are out there. I think we all sort of tread a fine line in that way, but it's it's something that I actually find I enjoy the challenge, and I particularly enjoy, and I don't know if you guys would agree, I particularly enjoy thinking of topics that would be of interest to a new audience, or to, sorry, when I mean new, I mean a non-Masonic audience, which we're looking at our stats and looking at the sort of the software that we use, we can see that there's a fair number of our listeners that aren't Freemasons. So that's really interesting to me, because it sort of demonstrates that there is a strong interest in Freemasonry and what it is and its role that it plays in society in 2025. But also, I think it's important to show the world, be it a non-Masonic audience, what Freemasonry actually is and the role that it plays, and particularly in things like community engagement and those sorts of areas that are so important to so many. And then us positioning Freemasonry as an entity and New Jelly as an organization that has a really important role to play within those spheres. So it's good. And I vividly remember when we started it, I was really nervous. I remember feeling, this sort of anxiety about, oh gosh, what if people don't think that it's very good, or, you just, you guys know better than anyone. You just have to close your eyes and jump, right? Because there's going to be a risk. It's not always going to be for everyone, but from our perspective, as long as we're producing content that is of interest to as many people as possible, and from what we can see, we think what we're doing is right. But and the audience just as well as we do. If they're not happy, they are not backwards in coming forwards and telling you. So we're always sort of conscious of that level of feedback.
Indeed, it is not. When I worked on the radio and on television for many years prior to my current role here at the Scottish Rite, and there was a distance for a long time where if somebody wanted to criticize you, they had to pick up a telephone or they had to write a letter, both of which require a grand amount of effort. So it didn't happen all that often unless they were really mad about something and or were really happy about something. And sadly, it was often really mad, not really happy. But now. Yeah. It takes a split second to send feedback, and so that it comes fast and furious. And do you get a lot of? I'll say it this way: we get a lot of. I call them the tinfoil hat people, sending us messages saying, you're Luciferians, you're all devil worshippers, you're controlling the world's money. Name a conspiracy theory, and from the Lindbergh kidnapping to stealing the Queen's crown jewels, we get blamed for all of it. Do you run into that same thing, or is it more accepted in the UK?
No, we get it. We get it.
Good. I'm glad. I'm glad it's not just me. That makes me feel a lot better.
It's not a pleasure that's only reserved to you guys. Don't worry. You know what it is? It's a tough one, because actually, in relation to the podcast and inbound sort of mail and whatnot that we get through the podcast, we haven't had that much of it actually. But looking at other, speaking for the United Grand Lodge of England, oh gosh, yes. I do a present. I travel around to lodges around the UK, and I talk about these things and how they sort of started and how they came about. And the way we deal with it is that we have a zero tolerance approach. So when we see this sort of thing for example, on social media, which is, as you guys will know, a bit of a spit for that sort of thing, we just block and we just shut it out, because at the end of the day, guys, we're not going to waste our time responding to it. It's not worth the oxygen that it would take to explain. So we tend to just ignore it. There are some things where, particularly some of the stuff that we get in relation, for example, to we had one recently about Jack the Ripper. Some of those sorts of things are just so ludicrous that we may well just put out some clarification. But you would spend your whole time doing it. It's probably a whole job. You could have a whole department whose job it is to fact check people online about Freemasonry. Unfortunately, it's one of those things, and I'm not sure that'll ever change. I mean, but one thing I know is that what we're doing, what you guys are doing in creating a podcast, creating another method for Freemasons to talk openly about the great things that we do and the role that we play in society in modern life is part of the way to tackle it, because it's only through sort of blocking out the noise, the negative noise, and really pushing forward that positive message. I think that's the way to deal with it. And before the pandemic, there was a big survey done by UGLE, which it was about 40,000 people were interviewed, non-Freemasons were interviewed to ascertain their views of Freemasonry. And the survey basically told us that, yes, there was a percentage of people who would never, ever consider becoming Freemasons and had these quite sort of baked in preconceptions about what it was, often inaccurate preconceptions about what it was. But there was actually, by far the largest group was those that didn't really have an opinion either way. And I think it's that common phase where you have people that seem to shout the loudest to the people that are listened to the most. It's tempting to do that with sort of things like social media and the platforms that exist nowadays. But actually, the reality is that the majority of people out there don't have a view. And that's generally how we approach both the podcast and our sort of communications output here, is that, we when we talk, we try and speak positively. We don't engage in negativity. And as I say, I think that's the best way to address it. I've yet to find another way. So if you guys have any hints, let me know.
No, that's exactly what we do. If someone asks a polite question, even if it's a challenging question about something, and it's coming from a place of real, honest curiosity, I do my best to answer it, and not take it as a personal affront that they, this may be someone who's been told, well, Masons are satanic. And if they're honestly asking, hey, is this true? I do my level best to answer that question and not shy away from that. But if someone just declares you're all Satanists and Luciferian and you're all controlling the world, and then that's not a person who's coming with a reasonable nature. So there's no point in treating it reasonably. You just cross it out and move on, because it's highly unlikely that any amount of discussion is going to change that person's mind online or otherwise. So why waste the pixels, so to speak? I do want to ask you, and you touched on this just a little bit, but when we first started this, it was 2012, I think, 2012 or 13, when we first started our podcast. And at that point, it was by Masons, for Masons. There weren't as many podcasts around, and so it was something to engage specifically the brotherhood. And we still say that, but there's been an evolution where a lot of what we do is for Masons, but also we have to acknowledge that there are non-Masons listening. And it's sort of a delicate balance of how are we engaging the members, how are we engaging non-members, and perhaps welcoming them, or at least explaining to them what we're doing. And it's this little balancing act, but it's with the website. It's with virtually everything we do. Do you find yourself in a similar situation where you've got to walk that tightrope?
Absolutely. The way that we get around that is that we try and position the content that we produce in a way, and we're not always successful at it, by the way. Sometimes I listen back to episodes and I think, I try and put myself in the shoes of someone who, as you say, sort of isn't a Freemason and therefore by default probably knows very little. And sometimes I listen back and I think, I wish that we'd maybe have clarified what that means, or, that's perhaps not particularly clear, but it's really hard. We've tried to counter that by doing what we call explainer episodes. And, the idea is that, we've done 3 or 4 of them now, and looking at the stats, they seem to be some of the more popular episodes that we do, because I think there is definitely a sort of interest in what some of that terminology means, and we try and be clear, but you find yourself, even when you're recording the episode and you're trying to explain what a worshipful master is, for example, or what a level is, or whatever it may be, and you think, has that actually explained it? Would, if I wasn't a Freemason, I had no idea about Freemasonry, how clear have we been? But I think there has to come a point where you have to just acknowledge that we're doing the best that we can. And something that we always say, a message that we always try to get across in the explainer episodes in particular, is that we'll say, we've tried our best to explain it, but if you want to find out, join. That's ultimately the best possible way for you to find out what these words mean. So I think primarily the issue for us really is considering that member side of things, and how much interest a member who's been Freemason for 25 years, for example, is going to take from an episode explaining what a worshipful master is, or what a warden is, or this pretty basic terminology. So that's sort of the challenge that we face. And you're absolutely right what you say. It's a tightrope. And actually, as I said, you're not going to please everybody, and that's fine. But it's I guess if you can look back at, because I don't know what you guys do, but we have sort of 12 or 13 episodes per series, and then we have a break for a little bit. And I think if we can look back at the end of a 12 or 13 episode run and think to ourselves, actually what we've got across the series is a broad spectrum of different topics and areas of interest that would interest both a Masonic and non-Masonic audience. I think that's the best you're going to do.
I completely agree. And one thing that we found when we were doing, we in 2020, they did a television show called The Lost Symbol, and it was based on the Dan Brown novel of the same name. And a portion of that book takes place in the building that I'm in now, the House of the Temple here in Washington. And NBC had long planned to do a show, and they were going to actually come here and film portions of it rather than build a large, expensive set. But then COVID happened, and it became more feasible for them to build the set than to try and deal with the international travel issues and what have you. So we had been excited to work with them on that, and they said, well, why don't you do an explainer? So every episode, you guys will let you use the footage any way you want. Just you can explain the difference between the real symbols and the fake symbols, and it was a great project to work on, and we put it on our YouTube channel. And what we found was that while we certainly were engaging with people who were not Masons and explaining basic Masonic concepts to them, we were also giving and filling in gaps for people who were for brothers who just didn't know. So when you talk about explaining the term worshipful master, yeah, every Mason knows what that is, but they don't understand the origin. They don't understand the usage of the word worshipful and things. So, I think that there is that gap in Masonic education, if you will, and at least I'm speaking for the States. So I think that I would imagine that a lot of the craft appreciate when you go a little further down those explanations, even in some basic concepts.
Yes, I think you make a very good point, and I think the way we see it also is particularly for those newer members. We all remember. Well, I certainly can. The night after my initiation, climbing into bed and laying there, staring at the ceiling and thinking, "Oh my goodness, what on earth has just happened?" And to be honest with you, nobody, I think, at that time then had really. In UGLE, we're really keen to make sure that when someone goes through that initiation, it can be quite an overwhelming experience. There's a lot happening, and actually having someone afterwards to sit next to them at the dinner, or just to pull them to one side at the bar and have a conversation with them and just say, actually listen, don't worry if none of it makes sense. Don't worry if only some of it made sense. And what we've started to do here quite successfully and in our more sort of successful lodges, what you see is pretty quickly getting that initiate to visit an initiation and see it for themselves. And if our podcast, if you are that person and you're sat there wondering what on earth you've experienced or reflecting on one of your ceremonies, our hope is that if you're listening, as you say, it can provide a bit more meat on the bones of that experience, and hopefully just mean that when you do eventually go along to a next meeting, or you visit and you go and see someone else go through the same thing, you're not as sort of blindsided or as overwhelmed as perhaps you were when you went through it yourself. So if we can do that, if we can play that role, awesome. That's great. We'll be delighted to do that. And at the same time, if we manage to do that and also, be a platform that's informative and interesting and engaging for people who perhaps are looking into joining, who are just showing a bit of interest, great. We're happy to do that. So if we can cover all of those bases, then we're chuffed, really.
Well, I think you guys are doing an excellent job of it. I'm not under the UGLE obviously, but I do enjoy all the stuff that you produce. I feel like I get to. It's not often that I get to talk to another official podcaster. So one of the criticisms that we receive is that we are, sort of propaganda, and we tend to take a positive look on things. We're not here to be overly critical of anybody or say these are the problems in the fraternity and shake our finger at people in the way that a traditional I'm using air quotes media outlet might. Are people critical of you for not going out there and righting the wrongs of the world, or for sort of being the and I guess propaganda is probably the right term, but you're looking at the good side of Freemasonry in your area, and we tend to do the same thing. We're here to talk about the positive, but we do get our share of criticism from the brothers. Do you have that as well, or are people a little more understanding?
We've had a little bit of it. I mean, I think there'd generally be a perception that, as you very eloquently put, you're not going to touch on anything that's remotely sort of negative. I mean, what I would say is that we encourage people to reach out to us, to send us emails, to get in touch, share their views, share their opinions, and occasionally, you'll get the odd sort of snarky remark or something, but actually, I think for us, what we try to do, and particularly, we're looking now at the sort of opening stages of our next season, but we want really to take the podcast out there to the membership. So we want them to feel. I feel like in our first season, there were certain tick boxes that we had to do. We had to interview certain people. There were initiatives that we had to cover because, as the official podcast, as you've rightly said, people expect that, and of course we're going to do that. We're going to cover those important things. But now we're moving on to, when we've passed, I think we've sort of passed that point, and we can really take the podcast out there. So a good example of this was in our last season, to mark the Remembrance Weekend here in the UK, which takes place in early November to commemorate the end of the First World War. We visited. We did like a 4-episode special focused on Freemasonry's unique relationship with the armed forces. And as part of that, we traveled to a military hospital in the Midlands, in Birmingham. And it was a Fisher House, which is, I believe, started in the United States. And it's an excellent charity. And it's basically it's a place where veterans can go to, and sort of veterans, if they're being treated in the hospital, which is just across the road, can go to be treated and looked after. And, we really going out there, taking the podcast, not being sat in our soundproof dungeon as it sort of looks at times. It's really sort of claustrophobic little room here at Freemasons Hall, and actually going out there and meeting Freemasons on their own patch in their own backyard was really interesting, and it gave, I think, the podcast a different feel, and I think anyone who then wanted to sort of push that view forward that, you're sort of towing the company line, or you're whatever it may be. I think that was a good example of where we are actually willing to engage and talk to people, and we really want to do that more going forward. But I think the reality is, and you'll know much better than I, with doing this, you have to just accept that you're going to get your naysayers, you're going to get your negative people who are always going to have something to say. But as long as I think we can put something out there that we're happy with, and we know that we're representing the best side of Freemasonry, I think we just need to take that as a win.
I think absolutely. And again, I'm a fan of your work. I think that you guys are doing an excellent job of juggling all the different aspects of it. And I'm kind of like you. There's so much negativity in the world in general. When I engage with my fraternity, whether it's in my professional capacity now, or whether I'm listening to your podcast as just a brother and a listener, I want to hear the good things, because the bad things are just, they're too easy and too overwhelming to absorb. So I like when I plug into you guys, it's going to be guys enjoying themselves, having fun, and there's not going to be, some harsh discussion of some problem that's happening in the fraternity. We all know what the problems are. We all know generally that there are, men are men, and Freemasonry is perfect, but men are not, and there's going to be argument and things of that nature. But I don't think focusing on that serves us. And it's really not what I'm there to consume. I really am here to seek out positivity. So I applaud you for it. And I know people are critical of us, and I kind of stopped caring whether or not they're critical about that we're the propaganda arm or something like that. It's like, if that's my job, is to be positive, well, what a terrible job I have then,
You're absolutely right. And it's great to hear. I mean, I feel like for us, when we started off, the ambition was actually, and actually listen, I'm an avid podcast listener anyway. So if I'm traveling, I'm invariably listening to a podcast, and the ones I listen to, the ones that I think seem to be more effective and better and of a higher quality, are the ones where actually the hosts seem really comfortable with one another. And I think the way that you project that comfort and that enjoyment is through just having a laugh and not taking yourself so seriously. And we know through some of the surveying that we've done of that sort of non-Masonic audience, that one of the misconceptions that they have is that all Freemasons are super serious and they take themselves far too seriously. And I think actually, and this isn't about denigrating the seriousness of the ceremonies or undervaluing how important those messages and lessons are that you gain through Freemasonry, but actually you can still talk about it in a way that promotes that enjoyment and brotherhood and fraternity. And for me, that's the good stuff. If you were to ask me if I was becoming a Freemason now, that would be the things that are attractive to me as a candidate, right? It's the going along and having a laugh with your friends, but it's also then, the seriousness of the lessons and the ceremonies and the lessons that you learn as a result of the ceremony. So you can have both, and actually, I think, and I know you guys are particularly good at it as well, you come away having listened, and you feel that actually Freemasonry is an organization that someone should want to become a member of, right? And particularly, again, in this time and society that we live in, there are so many competing factors for our time. And to ask people to commit, to give up, in a lot of London lodges, lodges that meet here in London will meet 4 or 5 times a year only, and to ask someone to commit to even that, which doesn't on the surface seem very much, is a big commitment in 2025. We've all got families and work and everything and other commitments. So to ask people to commit to that is big. So if you're not going to promote the fact that this thing is enjoyable and that you can go along and you can relax and you can enjoy yourself, we're going to struggle, I think, to encourage people to join. And that, as I say, aligned with the sincerity of the ceremonies and the importance of the lessons and what they teach us and how they make us better people, is absolutely key. I think that's a winning formula, actually.
Yeah, I could not agree more. And I think we tend to forget, and I'm saying we as a society, not as a fraternity here, I think we tend to forget on the whole that men are whole beings. We can sit down at the pub, or in our case, a bar here in the US, but we can sit down and we can have a couple of drinks and we can talk about sports, or we could talk about the seriousness of politics, or we could talk about the attractive young lady who has served us our drink. We can talk about all of those things seamlessly, because we are whole creatures. We are whole beings. We don't have to just be the grouchy past master. And if we talk about something other than the seriousness and greatness of Masonic ritual, we're somehow betraying ourselves. And it's just not the truth. We can, on one hand, talk about last night's football game and then tie that into something that happened into Lodge. We're an entire being. And I think that when people expect us to be too myopic, it robs us of the great thing about Freemasonry, which is that I would never have had the opportunity to speak with Brother Sean Butler if it were not for the Masonic fraternity. I mean, Matt and I were friends because we played in a band together for many years, but there are a lot of men that I know. One of my best buddies is a railroad engineer. I would have likely never met him if it were not for the fraternity. And so he and I are enabled to have an entire friendship and relationship that, while Freemasonry was the genesis of it, it isn't necessarily always the focus of it. And I think that when you've got a podcast group that doesn't mind being a whole person, and you and your co-hosts obviously have that down. I envy that, because I usually it's just you, me, or Matt talking to interviewing someone. I think you guys just do a great job of presenting Masons in a light that is, these are regular guys who happen to be members of this fraternity, and sometimes they talk just about that, but sometimes it's other things as well. And I think that's one of the beauties of the fraternity, to be honest. And I love that you're capturing that on tape.
No, thank you. That's really good to hear. And it's, as I say, it's amazing. I mean, I always talk about, just sort of building on what you just said. I always talk about the night of when I had my initiation, the night of my initiation. I remember being taken into to the dinner afterwards, and I was sat next to a chap who I think was 96 years old. And if I'm honest with you, and I was initiated when I was 21, so sort of young, naive, ignorant me, taken in and sat next to him. I thought, oh gosh, this is going to be a tricky hour and a half dinner, because what am I going to have in common with this person? And, genuinely, I think it's probably one of the most interesting evenings of my life, because this chap had fought in wars that I'd never heard of. He'd been to countries that, I could only dream of visiting. He'd lived life to the absolute extreme. But exactly what you just said, in what other sphere of life would I have found myself with that person for that period of time? I just wouldn't. And I found myself but the time flew by, and by the time we'd finished, I was having a conversation about and I could have sat with him for another 2 hours. I really could have. I could have sat with him for another evening, because he was so interesting. And also just sort of advice he was giving me and those sorts of things. And you think, gosh, how much money would you have to pay somebody, professionally to share this level of insight into how to sort of live an enjoyable life? I mean, it's invaluable. So, yeah, I mean, Freemasonry generally, that was a huge attraction to me when I was looking into joining. It was for me, being a sort of history fan and looking into history and seeing, people like Churchill, George Washington, these huge titans of history, these people who I hugely respect. What was it about Freemasonry that seemed to unite these people and bring these people and attract these people into Freemasonry? And I thought to myself, gosh, I need to experience this for myself. And now I get it. I fully understand it, because Freemasonry is a real leveler, and it's probably one of the very few spaces where these people could have gone to and just been themselves and not worry about, judgment or being judged or not being able to be themselves, etc. And that's a huge bonus for me in terms of Freemasonry. People just being themselves, and it doesn't matter what job you do or what religion what God you worship or what party you vote for. All of that doesn't mean anything. When you're in that lodge room, you're all the same, and you're all brothers, and you're all there to learn and become better people. And it's such an attractive prospect. And I maintain, I think it still has a huge role to play in society in 2025. It's who wouldn't want that? To me, it's such an attraction, and we need to get better, and we're determined to get better here at UJLE of presenting that side of it to the world, and saying that this is what it could offer you. Come along and find out more. It's something that we've really pushed more so recently, and the podcast has definitely helped us do that.
Yeah, you and I are complete agreement about that. And the we live in a time of such incredible division where, everything is this binary of black and white, yes or no. You can't. There are no shades of gray in which we can agree or disagree. It's you're for me or against me, and as Masons, we're under a gentleman's obligation and agreement to say, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to find and focus on the things that we agree on and work from there, rather than focus on the things that we disagree on and work from there. And I think that the world needs it now, arguably more than it ever has, because we've become so disconnected. And you can point to all the reasons. I mean, social media or the media in general. I mean, there's so many different things you can point to, politics and COVID-19. You can say these are all the various reasons. The reasons and who struck John almost is immaterial. The fact is we have to set it aside and say, okay, here's where we agree. Here's where we both think that things are good. Let's start from there and go from there. And when we get to a point where we disagree, we just don't need to talk about that right now. And Masons are under that agreement. And I think it's such a beautiful thing to be able to have. That's why I do what I do, because I think more people need to share that. And I'm glad to hear that you guys you have sort of a similar mission.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And what we see is we see people buying into it. We see people. There is, as I say, there's definitely an interest out there. People want to find out more. If anyone tells you otherwise, if anyone tries to say, as people have tried to say to me before, how is Freemasonry relevant? It 100% still is, and you and I do very similar things. A part of our role is to do that very thing. Is to be proactive in communicating those things in a clear and precise way, and not falling into the trap, I think, of simplifying it, because actually you don't need to. It's perfect as it is, which is why, unlike many other societies that have came up centuries and centuries ago, many of those have fallen by the wayside. Freemasonry stands strong still today. So what is it? What lessons can we learn from that? Well, we know that people love the tradition. I mean, particularly here, that still for us is one of the main reasons why people become Freemasons. They love that connection with their past ancestors. The idea that when you stand up in lodge and you deliver a piece of ritual, invariably you're saying something that, you're repeating something that's been written hundreds of years before, and for me, that connection with the past is something that should be treasured. And the lessons, as you've stated absolutely accurately, are still as relevant today, perhaps even more so than they were 300 years ago when UGLE, when the Premier Grand Lodge was found in the Goose and Gridiron pub near St. Paul's Cathedral. So actually, it as Freemasons, I think it's important that every now and then we take some time just to reflect on that. And I think when I do so, I know, speaking from my own experience, when I sit and reflect on that, I feel so immensely proud of my membership of Freemasonry, and it just empowers me so much more to go out and try and share that enthusiasm with others in the hope that they will then join too.
Before we let you go, and I could talk to you all day, to be honest. I always ask people before they leave our show the same question, and I'm gonna ask you, even though you're a professional Mason, and which is a very small part of our fraternity, or those of us who are blessed enough to be able to get to do this for a job. What was it that brought you to the door of Freemasonry originally? What made you knock on that door to begin with?
So for me, really, there were two parts to it. So the first part was that my grandfather was a Freemason, so there was a family connection there, and my mother would always tell me, stories about my grandfather going off, 6 or 7 times a year in his black suit, and with his briefcase, as we have here, and there was always an element of intrigue there for me, and I would sit and talk to him about it, and he would say, well, in this country now it's 18 you have to be to join. So he would say, well, when you're 18, come and speak to me. I'd be sort of counting down the days until my 18th birthday. So that for me, on two levels, being able to share that experience with my grandfather, who was able to attend my initiation, which was hugely meaningful.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah, huge for me, personally, to see me go through there. And it was one of the very few times I've ever seen him tear up. That generation are sort of made of different stuff, and he was really proud, and it meant a hell of a lot for me that he was there. And then sort of as I touched on before, really, I think it was being someone who's so interested in history, being able to have this direct connection between what I'm stood here doing now and what, the great people, so many great people of history have done before me, Winston Churchill, George Washington, all of these people who have made such a huge impact on the lives of all of us in one way or the other. What was it about Freemasonry that was the unifier? What was it that and you hear stories, from the US Civil War, even of, lodges and brethren sort of coming together in spite of the differences and what they were fighting over at the time. What they had that brought them together at the end of it. One of the great unifiers was Freemasonry. And when we see that all over the world, we see that, we hear stories here of prisoner of war camps during the Second World War where, prisoners in Singapore and that had been captured by the Japanese were sort of fashioning gavels and levels out of scrap pieces of wood that they could find and holding sort of off the cuff lodge meetings as best as they could. And for me, if you think about, and I remember vividly, my own grandfather was a prisoner of war. He was held in the Far East for a number of years until the end of the Second World War. But it was, that thing for me of, gosh, what is it about this thing that in the face of that horrible situation, that this thing brought you so much joy and so much comfort that you would go to those lengths to try and replicate that experience in those horrendous surroundings. For me, it was never really an option for me not to dig deeper and find out more. So as soon as I was able, I was going along and I was joining, and I'm delighted to say that it at no point has it disappointed me. At no point have I ever felt the need to look back and think, oh, that wasn't quite what I thought. It's been everything that I thought it was going to be and more. And I think there are so many people out there, who knows, maybe some that are listening to us speak now, who are sort of thinking to themselves, I don't know whether it's for me. I don't know if it's for me. Go along, ask somebody, talk to somebody about it, find out, because genuinely for me, it's changed my life. And I hear that from so many people that it's been a life-changing experience for them. And, if you don't know, just ask someone and they'll be more than willing to talk to you, because that's what I did. And, I'm hugely, hugely delighted that I did so.
Really can't thank Brother Sean enough for the time that he took to sit and chat with Brother Maynard, share some information and experiences of his time both working and being a member of this great fraternity of ours. If you want to learn more about the United Grand Lodge of England, simple thing to do is go to their website, ugle.org.uk. You can also check out their YouTube page at youtube.com/@Grand Lodge of England, and then click on the podcast portion of their YouTube page. You can see a really good podcast series called the 1723 Podcast. It's a 10-part series celebrating the 300th anniversary of the 1723 Constitutions. It's well worth your time to check out. So until next time, thank you for listening to the Tyler's Place Podcast, the official podcast of the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry, Southern Jurisdiction, Mother Supreme Council of the World. I'm your host, Matt Bowers, and we'll see you next time.